Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show where we take complex scientific knowledge, find the core insights, and make sure you walk away with a solid understanding.
And today, we're really getting into the foundations of biology. We're talking about how we name life and, maybe more importantly, how we map its entire evolutionary history.
A science called phylogeny.
Exactly. And the discipline that does all this work is called systematics. It's a huge task, with millions of species out there. Our mission today is to break it down into 6 key concepts you can really get a handle on.
And we're going to kick things off with a creature that is just a perfect example of why this is so tricky. It's called the glass lizard.
Right. And if you saw one, you would swear on a stack of textbooks that you were looking at a snake.
It's legless, it slithers, it's a snake.
But it isn't. Not even close, really. When you look at the deep anatomy, it's missing the key things that make a snake a snake.
Like what?
Well, for one, a supermobile jaw for swallowing big prey. And also just the sheer number of vertebrae that gives snakes that incredible flexibility. The glass lizard is, well, it's just a lizard that lost its legs.
And that idea right there, looking past the surface to find the real evolutionary story, that's the whole point of this deep dive.
It is. We're going to start with the classic naming system, move to how we use physical and molecular data to build these family trees, and then
see how new genetic data is kind of turning the whole tree of life on its head.
making it a lot messier, yeah. So let's start at the beginning, how we organize things.
That journey starts back in the 18th century with Carolus Linnaeus. He gave us the system we still use today.
Binomial nomenclature, the 2-part name.
Right. You have the genus, always capitalized, and then the specific epithet, which is lowercase.
And both are italicized, like Panthera produced the leopard.
Or the one he famously gave us, Homo sapiens.
Ah, yes, Homo sapiens.
The wise man.
Let's not get into whether we're living up to the name. Good point. But beyond the names, Linnaeus gave us this nested hierarchy. You group species into genera.
Then genera into families, orders, classes, phyla, kingdoms, and now all the way up to domain.
In any one of those named groups, at any level, is called a taxon. But here's the thing. That system is great for filing, but it doesn't automatically show you who's related to whom.
For that, you need a phylogenetic tree, the roadmap.
Yes, these are the visual hypotheses of evolution. And the key things to look for are the branch points.
And each branch point is what exactly?
It's the most recent common ancestor of the 2 lines that are splitting off from it.
Okay, and if you have 2 groups that share one of those immediate branch points and nobody else shares it,
Then they're called sister taxa. Humans and chimpanzees are the classic example. We are sister taxa.
so the whole tree has a root, which is the ancestor of everything on the diagram.
Right, and sometimes you'll hear the term basal taxon, which is just a group that split off really early in the history of that larger group.
Now, you mentioned that people often misread these trees. What are the common mistakes?
The biggest one is assuming they show appearance. They don't. They show patterns of descent.
Give me an example of that.
Crocodiles. They look like big, scaly lizards. You'd group them together visually in a heartbeat.
Here.
But phylogenetically, crocodiles are way more closely related to birds than they are to lizards.
Wow, okay, that's a big one. What's the next mistake?
Reading the tips like a ladder of progress. The tree does not say humans evolved from chimpanzees.
It says we shared a common ancestor.
Exactly. Both of our lineages have been evolving independently for millions of years since that split.
And the last one is about time, right?
Yeah. Don't assume the branch lengths mean anything about time unless the diagram specifically says so. A lot of the time, they're just drawn for clarity.
But when you can use that data, these trees become really powerful tools. I'm thinking of that whale meat study.
Oh, that's a great application. Yeah, researchers use DNA phylogenies to test whale meat being sold in Japanese markets.
And
They could compare the DNA sequence from the meat to a database of known whale species. They found illegally harvested species being sold, all by using evolutionary history to enforce conservation law.
That's incredible. And it really brings us to the data itself. How do scientists sort through all the traits to build these trees?
Well, the first big challenge is separating similarities that matter from those that don't.
You mean homology versus analogy?
Precisely. Homology is similarity because of shared ancestry. Think about the bones in your arm, a bat's wing and a whale's flipper. Different functions, but the same underlying bone structure. That's homology.
And analogy.
That's when similar environments push unrelated species to develop similar traits, We call it convergent evolution.
This is where the moles come in.
The moles are the perfect example. You have the African golden mole and the Australian marsupial mole. They look almost identical. Big digging claws, tiny eyes.
Built for a life underground.
Exactly. But the genetic data shows their lineages split 160 million years ago. Their common ancestor looked nothing like a mole. The similarity is purely analogous.
So how do you tell the difference if you're looking at, say, a complex bone?
There's a rule of thumb.
Yeah.
The more complex the structure and the more parts that are similar, like comparing all the little bones in a human skull to a chimp skull, the more likely it is that they're homologous. It's just too unlikely for that much complexity to evolve twice by chance.
And this same logic applies to genes.
It does. Homologous genes have similar DNA sequences.
Yeah.
But it gets tricky with distantly related species because you have to use computers to align the sequences to account for insertions and deletions over millions of years.
It feels like the molecular data often tells a different story than the physical appearance.
Oh, absolutely. Look at the Hawaiian silver swords. You have some that are tall, woody trees, and others that are these tiny little ground-hugging shrubs. They look completely different.
But their DNA.
Their DNA is incredibly similar. The molecular divergence is tiny. It tells us their common ancestor only lived about 5 million years ago, and they diversified extremely rapidly to fill all those different island niches.
So once you have these reliable characters, these homologies, what's the method for actually drawing the tree?
That brings us to cladistics. This is the main approach used today. It's all about classifying organisms based on common ancestry.
And it groups them into these clades.
Entolades, right. And to be a proper clade, a group has to be monophyletic.
Monophyletic. Okay, break that down.
It means the group includes an ancestral species and all of its descendants. No exceptions.
What's an example of a group that isn't that?
Well, a paraphyletic group is one that includes the ancestor, but some, not all, of the descendants. The old school definition of reptiles is the classic case.
How so?
It includes turtles, snakes, lizards, crocodiles, but it leaves out birds.
Even though birds evolved from that same reptile lineage.
Exactly. By leaving them out, you've created an artificial paraphyletic group. To make reptilia a true clade, you have to include birds.
So a lot of these familiar groups are actually biologically incorrect.
In a strict cladistic sense, yes. They don't represent the full history.
And there's one more type of group, the one biologists try to avoid.
The polyphyletic group. This is when you lump together distantly related species, but you leave out their most recent common ancestor.
Like grouping seals and whales just because they have flippers?
Perfect example. Their streamlined bodies are analogous, not homologous. Their common ancestor was a land animal, so the grouping is artificial.
Okay, so to build these proper clades, we need the right kind of evidence. We're looking for shared derived characters.
Precisely. You have to separate those from shared ancestral characters. A backbone is an ancestral character for mammals because all vertebrates have one. It doesn't help you define mammals as a unique group.
But something like hair.
Hair is the shared derived character, or synapomorphy. It's an evolutionary novelty that is unique to the mammal clade.
So can you walk us through building a simple cladogram? How does it work in practice?
Sure. You start by choosing an outgroup, a species that's closely related but branched off before the group you're studying, your in-group. For vertebrates, a lancelet is a good outgroup.
It sets the baseline.
It does. Then you look at your in-group, say a lamprey, a base, and a leopard. You look for the first derived character that everyone in the in-group has, but the outgroup doesn't. And that's the vertebral column.
The backbone.
The backbone, that's your first branch. Then you look for the next innovation, hinged jaws. Well, the lamprey doesn't have them, so it branches off next. Then you might look for, say, forelimbs, and then hair. Each character defines a smaller, more exclusive group within the larger one.
And the branches on that tree can mean different things. Sometimes it's just a diagram, but sometimes the lengths matter.
Right. They can be drawn to be proportional to the amount of genetic change. So a long branch means a lot of mutations have accumulated in that lineage.
Or they can represent time.
Or time. If you calibrate the tree with fossil data, you can actually put dates on those ancient branch points.
But with millions of species, the number of possible trees is, it must be astronomical. How do you pick the right one?
You're right. You can't test them all, so you apply principles. The most famous one is maximum parsimony.
Which is basically Occam's razor.
It's exactly Occam's razor for evolution. The simplest explanation is the best. The tree that requires the fewest evolutionary events, the fewest DNA-based changes, for example, is the one you accept as your best hypothesis.
And there's another method.
maximum likelihood.
That's more statistical.
It uses rules about how DNA is known to change over time to calculate which tree is the most likely to have produced the genetic data you actually see.
What's so powerful about this is you can use these finished trees to make predictions about the past. This is phylogenetic bracketing.
Yes, this is so cool. You can infer traits of extinct animals by looking at their living relatives. So birds' closest living relatives are crocodiles,
An odd couple.
a very odd couple.
Yeah.
But they both share things like four-chambered hearts, they sing to communicate, and they build nests and care for their eggs.
So the hypothesis was,
That dinosaurs, which are wedged right between crocodiles and birds on the tree, must have done these things too.
and we found fossil proof.
We did. The famous oviraptor fossil found crouching over a nest, just like a modern bird. It was a stunning confirmation of a prediction made using a phylogenetic tree.
The ability to compare whole genomes now has supercharged all of this, but it's also added some new layers of complexity.
It really has. We now have to be very careful to distinguish between two types of homologous genes.
Orthologous and paralogous.
Right. Orthologous genes are the ones we use to trace out the tree of life. They're genes that diverge after a speciation event. So the gene for synchropy in humans and dogs is orthologous.
And paralogous.
Paralogous genes come from a gene duplication event within a single species. The organism ends up with extra copies, and those copies can then evolve to do new things. Our family of olfactory receptor genes is a huge set of paralogous genes.
It's just amazing how much we share. Humans and mice have 99% of our genes in common.
And we share 50% of our genes with yeast. A billion years of separate evolution, and half the blueprint is still the same.
What does that tell you?
It tells you the complexity isn't just about having more genes. Humans only have about 4 times as many genes as yeast. It means our genes are incredibly versatile and multifunctional.
So if these genes are changing over time, some of them must change in a pretty steady rate.
And that's the whole idea behind the molecular clock. If you can figure out the rate, you can use the number of mutations to estimate how long ago 2 species diverged.
But you have to calibrate the clock, right? It's not perfect.
Oh, not at all. You have to calibrate it using the fossil record. And different genes tick at different speeds. Ribosomal RNA evolves incredibly slowly, so it's good for deep time. Mitochondrial DNA evolves really fast, so it's good for recent events.
The example of HIV is a really powerful application of this.
It is. By sequencing virus samples collected over many years and knowing the mutation rate of HIV, scientists were able to run the clock backwards
To find the origin point.
to estimate when the virus first jumped to humans. They dated the main strain, HIV-1M, to sometime around the 1930s, maybe as early as 1910. It put a real timeline on the start of the pandemic.
Okay, this brings us to the last and maybe the most disruptive idea in the whole deep dive, how all this new data is redrawing the tree of life.
Yeah, the old five-kingdom system just couldn't survive the flood of genetic data.
The kingdom Monera, for all the prokaryotes, was the first to go.
It had to. The organisms in that single kingdom were so genetically different, they ended up being split into 2 entire domains.
Creating the 3-domain system, bacteria, archaea, and eukarya.
Exactly, and the old kingdom Protista also fell apart because it was massively paraphyletic, a grab bag of leftovers.
But even with 3 domains, the picture was confusing. Some genes suggested eukarya were closer to archaea, but other genes suggested we were closer to bacteria.
And the answer to that puzzle is a process that fundamentally changes how we think about evolution. Horizontal gene transfer.
Meaning genes moving sideways, not just down from parent to child.
Exactly. Genes being transferred between completely different species through viruses, plasmids, even fusions of whole organisms.
And this wasn't just a rare freak occurrence.
Not at all. It was rampant, especially in early life. Some studies suggest that up to 80% of the genes in a typical prokaryote genome have been transferred horizontally at some point in their history.
Wow. And it even happens across domains.
It does. There's an alga, Galderia sulfuraria, that lives in insanely harsh volcanic springs. Turns out it acquired about 5% of its genes directly from bacteria and archaea that already lived there, which gave it the tools to survive.
So if genes are jumping all over the place, what does that do to our nice, neat branching tree?
It breaks it, especially at the base. The traditional tree assumes everything is vertical inheritance. But with so much horizontal transfer early on, the base of the tree of life is probably less of a single trunk and more of a tangled web.
A tangled web of connected branches? That is a radically different image.
It is.
So we've gone from Linnaeus's neat boxes to cladistics and shared characters to molecular clocks and now this tangled web at the dawn of life.
And I think that's the big provocative thought to leave you with. The history of life isn't just a story of divergence and branching. It's also a story of connection and exchange, of genes jumping across vast evolutionary gulfs. Our ability to read entire genomes has revealed a history that's far more complex and interconnected than we ever imagined.
It's a reminder that the map is always being redrawn as we discover more. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the very heart of biological history.